Hey guys, welcome to another episode. Today I'm going to go over some SPAC lockup trades which we've had recently. Been a while since my last video, but just haven't really had any like really good videos that I wanted to put out, and I'm not looking to just keep pumping out bad videos. But yeah, going to be a bit more straight to the point with this one because I've already done a video on SPACs and more of the details on that, so you can check that out if you haven't. I'm going to go over like a couple things I look for and then a couple examples. So yeah, let's get into it. So most of the time coming to a lockup, I already have like alerts. So say a company I'm interested in goes public, for example, Rumble. I'll check in the S4, which is a registration statement, or even the S1 after they de-SPAC, and find out when the lockup is, and if there are any other terms. So I think especially if it's like an interesting name, a lot of these companies they'll not a lot, but sometimes they'll waive lockup agreements for a certain amount of shares. So as soon as it de-SPACs, they can sell. But usually that's not the case. All right, the number one thing I would say with these is the more shareholders, the better. So you don't really want a setup where there's like one guy who owns all the shares. So I'll show you an example of that soon. But let's say there's like some venture capital fund which basically owns 90% of the float or all the shares outstanding. That's not one that's likely to get sold, right? Because they have no interest in doing that. And the other thing I'll say is institutions, as far as I know, since probably early last year or even before, they don't really buy any of these SPACs until after lockups. So naturally, you're not going to get a super strong bid coming into these lockup expiries. So all it really takes is one guy who has a good amount of shares to say, hey, I want to sell, and it can destroy the stock. So that's why the more shareholders the better, right? Because then there's less reason for it to get held up, and you just need one guy to dump it for the stock to dump 10, 20, 30%, right? It's good to have somewhat of an idea what the company might be worth. If it's a shitco, you can be like, oh, this can dump 30%. You come up with your own valuation reasons. I don't think there's too much to look into with this. But yeah, just keep that in mind, obviously. And they can be very complicated, and there's a lot of them, so it's hard to keep track of them. I would say probably a third to maybe half of the ones that I take, I don't find myself. So there's some good follows on Twitter. I'm sure everyone knows that there's like Egg Platypus, All Diligence, and so forth. And another thing to consider is the amount of shares that is unlocking relative to float. Say you have like 100 million float already, and 1 million shares getting unlocked. Like, yeah, it's just irrelevant. So here's an example of a good shareholder setup versus a bad one. So this is like BuzzFeed. You can just see there's a ton of shareholders, blah, blah, blah. Don't really have to look too much into it. And then you have this one where Vista Funds owns 83%, right? Now, if a fund owns so much of this, they're likely already in talks with all these other guys. And these guys know that if Vista Funds is backing it, there's no rush for them to sell their shares, right? Because odds of it just going straight down, it's unlikely, right? Whereas here, all these guys are in, like, they might be like, oh, is he going to sell? Is he going to sell? Blah, blah, and they might, want to race to get out, right? But it also ties in with also like, the company, I should say. But yeah, for example, like let's say some venture cap took some terrible, invested in some company, 5 years later find out they're terrible, and then they go public, they might be looking to get out, right? So here's that first one, BuzzFeed. You can see it got demolished, and then here's CVT. This is a good example one, right? Because clearly someone sold, on the open, so you got that gap down day. But I was actually short this name, and after that opening imbalance, no more sells, and it just had a steady bid. So yeah, so this is also just to show you, right? Like even if it's not a good one, all it takes is one guy to sell. I think this was 1 million shares or something he sold. I can't remember exactly. And it dropped like 40, 50%, whatever it was. Okay. All right, so let's get into like one example. So first off, we got Rumble. So let me just show you. So this is looking at the S4. Let's see if the link works. So you can see in connection with the blah, 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 the securities held by such Rumble shareholders would be locked up for 1 year. Okay, and you can read these. Now, these guys will always have like, some other clauses, but never ever these could get triggered, right? So yeah, basically, so for Rumble, we knew it was for 1 year. How can I get this link? And then if you want to see the closing date, one way to do it is just go to S1, or you can just look at the chart, or you can just Google it as well, and then you can see, so September 16th. So what I like to do is I'll go, in this case, it was 12 months, right? So we'll go, it's simple when it's 12 months, right? You can do that. But if they say like 180 days, you can do that. And then it'll tell you the exact date, right? But for 12 months, it's pretty simple, right? Now, so continuing on with Rumble. So 300 million shares were to sell. Now, the CEO owned 140 million-ish, and he said he wouldn't sell, right? So you still have around 160 million. Recently had a short report from Culper, so, explaining it's a deteriorating business, blah, blah, blah. Just more reasons like to think why the valuation could be lower. And you got a high retail shareholder base, and the average daily volume on the name was only like 1 million. And now let me actually just quickly show, because I forgot to. So you can just go like this. It's not right. And you can just see, there's a bunch of other shareholders, blah, blah, blah. You can look at this in your own time. All right. Anyway, so here's a daily chart. So to me, it was like a decent setup, right? It's just, into this, it was making lower highs. It had earnings recently, which got sold, but still a bit off the lows. I kind of view these as usually they make, new all-time lows. So, coming into it, I thought it was okay. I mean, it would have, to be honest, been better if it was like down here, but that was fine. So on this day here, I started some short. I didn't do puts in this one because I was not, that prepared in advance, but I think, this is one to put on puts as well. And yeah, so I'll just show you how the intraday looks. So I was shorting some on the day before, and then coming into the day, you can just see you get that large volume and just consistent. And this was on a Monday because the lockup expired on a Saturday. And yeah, and then I just, added to my short position and just pretty much held. And I think I got enough an ad in this, wedge breakdown. And I'm just going to, when we get to VFS, I'll give a more detailed explanation. I'm just going to go through a couple pretty quickly. So here's what Rumble did after, went from 660 down to like 450, right? And this was a decently liquid one as well, which was nice. So that's Rumble. BETR. So this one I didn't find myself. I wasn't prepared for either. But we'll quickly take a look why this was a pretty cool one, in my opinion. So you can see following the closing, 36% of the shares are going to be freely tradable. Now, BETR, if you don't know, was AURC, right? Which was that super low float SPAC, which had a massive run up, and it just held up. At the time, I think it was the lowest SPAC on the market. I know a bunch of retail were in it, blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden, they de-SPAC on this day here. And coming into that, right, you have a 250K-ish float, maybe even a bit less. And 36% of 570 million is 205 million shares. This is probably the largest unlock relative to float I've ever heard of in whatever scenario you want to say. It's insane. And the other thing, which I did in the pre-market on the morning of when I understood what was going on, was just try to find a good comparison to see like what it might be worth, right? And it's pretty similar business to RKT, which traded like a 3x. I can't remember if it's sales. I can't remember exactly my notes. And I estimated it to be like around $1 and better. Now BETR, just a much more toxic like dilution setup, right? So you'd expect it to go lower than $1. And apparently it's the worst company as well. So here's the pre-market on the day of when they changed the ticker, and you can see it just started getting smoked in the pre-market. I could not get a borrow at all on this day. So if anyone did, that would have been a pretty good opportunity to get some size above 2 or whatever. And then you can see intraday on the first day just got smoked. I thought this was a good mean reversion long here as well. Breaks down, you get 2 down halts, and then it fails lower and then up halts. I did take this, but it's very hard to get conviction on these mean reversion down halts when there's like a strong catalyst or there's a lot of potential dilution, because the bounces on them tend to not be that great. And so yeah, but yeah, I didn't take much size, and then I thought this next day was the big up, right? So you get after hours when it's trading thin, you get a double pretty much off the lows, or if not more. And in my opinion, when I woke up the next morning, I saw this like, oh, well, how is this up here? This doesn't make sense. It should be, like $1 or below. Clearly, someone was, selling or involved the prior day. And really, in my opinion, the only way, you can get such a move is because it's in the extended hours, right? When it's thin. All it takes is one bidder. And also any big player who's looking to unload, it might be in their interest to try and, take it up first to be able to sell. I don't know if people actually do that. I'm just, random guess. And then you get this 4 AM move higher, which fails. I didn't put any on here, but when it broke trend and pumped to V up, I was like, okay, this is a pretty good bet in my opinion that you can short versus the highs. Because at this point, there's only like 3 hours into the open. And I think with something like this, the more time that goes on, the better it is, to expect it to, revert back down, right? Because coming into the open, more volume is going to come in. And when more volume comes in, it's just going to be pretty much impossible for this to hold up, right? As you have all those other hundreds of millions of shares coming in to try and exit. And so when we, started feeling lower, clear trend change, right, I added, and then, yeah, that was a decent fade. I ended up getting out, I think, into the afternoon. Didn't really feel like swinging it, but, looking back, it was probably like a good swing short. Okay. Now we're going to go to VFS. So I did the prior video on that one, and then we had another great, which was the ARB trade, and then we had a great trade on the SPAC lockup trade. So let me just, I don't even remember what link this is. Let's check. So, okay, so yeah, so VFS, if you look up this F1. Now, if you guys remember in my other SPAC video, most of these shares have to be registered for them to be able to be sold. And I'll show you an example later of one which got registered after the lockup expired. But that's towards the end of the video. But yeah, so anyways, VinFast, you can see 46 million shares can be sold from time to time, and they got rid of the lockup agreement for those. And also it might be in this link here. Let me see. And also the sponsor for 4 million shares, got waived. And the big thing is the sponsor, you have to know, as well as, likely the insiders, they have their shares from such a low average. And particularly the sponsors, they get it for dub force or 0.004. So you can just imagine, selling even at $1 to them is like a big gain. And, if they have a chance to sell above $10, like that's just insane for them. But yeah, but looking back on 9/21, because they had filed their F1 a couple days before, and I don't think they waived much then. And then on 9/21 they amended, and that's when they announced that there was going to be a ton of shares free of the lockup. And so in the next picture, which let me go back to the slideshow format. So that's here. So you can see like it already started breaking down there, because I think at this point people started anticipating that, with how fast VFS was moving with the registrations and SEC coming back to them, that, in a couple weeks, a month or two, they'd eventually get effect, and you'd have that crazy amount of shares being able to get sold, right? But not going to really go over that. I think this was a good day to maybe start positioning in short if you want, but usually these take 2 to 3 months. This one was obviously much quicker, so I think buying puts in December, the 10s, for example, was probably the way to go. But you can look at that if you want. I'm not going to go over the options. And then on the effect day, I think the flow was around 7-8 million-ish. Might have been a little bit more, a little bit less. Don't know exactly. And then you have 46 million insiders shares plus 5 million from the sponsor-ish. And that's this day here. And we're going to go over that. Now, what clearly a lot of people did not realize, because you'll see on the next picture, is they did not realize that this 424B3 meant effect was in. Now, effect only gets disclosed to the public, the next day at 6 AM. And we can actually check right now when they got effect. So we'll go to VFS. October 2nd, is that right? I think that's right? 2nd. Yeah, so they got effect at 9 AM, right? And so the public won't find out about it until the next day at 6 AM. But, quickly after they filed the 424B3, to me, that was the signal. Effect is in. These guys can start selling their shares. So I put on some short. I'll show execution in the next chart, but I can't do it in the pre-market. So I put some short on versus 12, and expecting it to get sold. But then off the open, really did not get any of those signs. So I didn't do anything. I just kept my stop, to 12, and it didn't get hit, luckily. And then once we started getting these fails under VWAP, and then you start seeing volume increasing, coming into low days. To me, that's a big sign that, finally there's a seller into it, and knowing how much range there potentially will be when, they dump these shares, because VinFast is still crazy overvalued, as I'm sure most of you know. There's not a mega rush. You want to be more certain than not. So, I was adding and then adding. And then in this wedge break, I also added a bit because it just reminded me of Rumble, which you guys saw before. And, it was coming to, big level, $10. So here's kind of my executions. These weren't really much size, but yeah, so here. So I had my pre-market short, and then I added some, and then I started adding more as it kept breaking down. And, then in this, wedge break, I was adding some. These are really tiny ads. And then I got some more ads here. And at this point, when it broke 10, I lowered my stop overall. So that's why I got some ads down here. And then the next day, the public found out about effect. I clearly heavily underestimated how retarded people are, that they didn't realize effect was already in. Had I known or had a bit more expectation this could happen, I would have been in way more size the prior day. And I think that just shows, the advantage of, being prepared on something when most people aren't. But yeah, I mean, that was it for VinFast really. I had like a couple like small trades in the next few days. And then I got out on Friday. Now the only reason I got out, I do think it goes lower, but I'm fine to get back in. But the bar rate keeps going up, and in their earnings call they said they didn't sell any shares, so it kind of makes me think that it was just some people, shorting it, a lot of big shorts, because the bar rate went from like 60% to 240%. So I don't know what's going to be in what's going to happen, but I think it does go lower. All right, next up, CXAI. So this was another low flow DSPAC AI runner. I'm sure everyone knows about it. But it was part of like a special spinoff for INPX shareholders, big retail name. They got 5 million shares. So this one, for example, another one I didn't find myself. This was from All Diligence. He tweeted about it, and you can see INPX shareholders got over 7 million shares. But they unlocked some earlier, so that's why it was only like 5 million. I'll show you in the next slide. And the sponsor shares also were unlocked for 6 million shares. And the float back then was like 2 million. Terrible company, blah, blah, blah. And, with retail shareholders being waiting for months to be able to sell their shares, it just made sense why this would get wrecked. So here you can see when they unlocked some of the shares of the retail shareholders back in March, and, it got smoked. And then a couple days prior to the lockup, we had this pump day. And yeah, and then coming into this day, in the pre-market, it wasn't doing much volume, but I managed to get some size in the pre-market, and then I added some before the open. Just because I saw in stock tweets that, retail was starting to get in their shares, which told me that, okay, people are going to be looking to sell today. And I think, and then, off the open, I added some. But I wasn't as aggressive because, it's a thinner name, you never know what could happen, blah, blah, blah. But I think it's also similar to BETR in terms of that pre-market, what I was mentioning, that the more time that goes on, and the lower this holds, the more probability of it like really working out, because people are going to start getting their shares over time and time. And I think only like here around this time is when the TD people got their shares, so you have to be a bit patient. And then the next day I covered it. All right. Yeah. The other thing I will mention before I go over this AMPX is it seems like sometimes these shareholders don't get their shares for a day or 2 or 3 days, and I think that's more to do with the transfer agent. Not sure the exact reason why, but if we just go back to BuzzFeed lockup ended here. You can see nothing happened, and then boom. So do keep that in mind. Just because the lockup expires, they might not sell it for a day or 2. So anyways, coming back to AMPX, this one to me was another one I was prepared for a long time. Much thinner name, as you can see, but I thought it could have been a decent one. And I'm not going to go over the details because I think you should look into it. Anyone who's watching this that's interested in these. And I think it still will be a very good one. They're doing something soon. I'm not going to explain the details because I think it'd be a good one for you to find out, where something might happen to where this could still be a really good lockup sell. And if you think back to the CVT example where there's a large concentrated ownership, you can kind of tie that into this as to why it didn't really work out. But yeah, if anyone's interested, go look at this one, go look at the filings, and you should be able to figure it out. And then here's the DCFC example. So this green arrow here is when they got effect on their registration. sorry, when the lockup expired, it was around here. I just went off memory. And you can see nothing got sold because they didn't have effect, right? So the shares weren't registered. And then here's when they got effect, and then a couple of days later, someone decided to start selling, and you can see it just got destroyed. But yeah, that's it. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Yeah, let me know any questions, and if anyone ever comes any good lockup SPAC stuff or anything really, and you like the idea, feel free to shoot it by me, and I can give my thoughts and also like getting new trade ideas. Thanks for watching.